Welcome back. We're discussing critical periods in second language acquisition. And in this part of the lecture, we're going to take a look at a couple of influential and interesting papers in this area. And this is just a small sampling of all the stuff that's out there. But the Johnson and Newport paper that we'll start with has been particularly influential in this literature. So it's accepted by one sort of team of people who believe in critical periods and second language acquisition, and it's been heavily criticized, on the other hand, by a sort of opposing camp in this area that we'll hear more about in the next lecture, who don't believe in critical periods for second language acquisition. But let's take a look at what the study actually does and what it finds, because this is really sort of laying the framework within which most of the other studies we'll see in this area have been done. And so the basic setup here is going to be very similar to what we see in other studies. So what did Johnson and Newport do here? They recruited 46 Korean and Chinese immigrants to the United States, and the age of arrival in the United States, excuse me, for the subject group has a real wide variety of ages. So the age of arrival here ranges from people who came at 3 years old all the way to people who came at 39 years old. And interestingly, there's a sort of a confound here because they were testing people generally in the adult age group, which means that we should expect that people who came later, at a later age, have been here for less years, all else being equal. Still, we're going to try to factor that out. These are all highly educated speakers, so they were recruited from the University of Illinois community. So you can expect that most of these people are probably researchers, professors, people like that. So they may or may not be indicative of what's happening in the larger population, but this is the sample we have, and this is what we're going to look at. And so we're going to try to use this age of arrival variable as a predictor to see how they do in their ultimate attainment in English. So this is the way that most of these studies are going to be set up. We're going to take age of arrival, where we have a wide range of differences among different people here, and we're going to see what use that variable is in predicting how well people do on some kind of measurement of their English ability. All right, so in this particular experiment, the idea is to run these subjects through a battery of well-formedness judgments involving morphological and syntactic generalizations in English. And I should have put here also lexical generalizations. So we'll look at some of the kinds of items on this scale in just a bit. But the basic idea here is mainly what we're interested in is age of arrival, right? So do people who came to the country at a younger age end up having more native-like judgments about English? But at the same time, as we mentioned in the previous section of this lecture, this is going to be confounded with a whole bunch of other variables, right? So all else being equal, people who came at an earlier age are going to have been here longer. They're going to have more exposure to formal education, and they might have different attitudes with regard to English. And so what Johnson and Newport are going to do is they're going to do their best to control for those confounding properties statistically, and ultimately that's going to be a pretty difficult job. So actually adjusting for confounders is a extremely tricky technical problem in applied statistics, and it's a weak design in some ways. It's sort of the best we can do with this particular subject group, but we should take everything here with a grain of salt, especially when it comes to trying to disentangle which one of these confounded variables actually contributes to differences in ultimate attainment. So trying to adjust for statistical confounders is extremely tricky. You can never be entirely sure you've done it right, and it's an inherently noisy and messy process. That said, Johnson and Newport are going to do their best, and they're going to try to see, once you separate out all of these different confounded variables, which one has the most important effects on ultimate attainment. So first, they're just going to look at age of arrival, and then they're going to try to disentangle the confounding variables. Let's take a look at what they found. Oh, but before we do that, very important in all of these studies, let's take a detailed look at the materials they actually use, because as we noted before, language is not a monolithic thing that you can just go out and measure. And so the results of any study are going to depend on the particular tasks and behaviors that you're having the subjects complete. So it's really important to pay attention to what those tasks look like. So here's a sort of sampling I just pulled out of the paper of some of the different kinds of things that Johnson and Newport are testing in their their instrument of different kinds of well-formadness judgments. And these are basically paired grammatical and ungrammatical expressions in English, where the grammatical ones have no special mark and the ungrammatical ones are marked with these asterisks to the left of them. And so starting out, we have some pretty simple ones here. This is things like numeral agreement. So the farmer bought 2 pigs at the market versus the farmer bought 2 pig at the market. Where it's pretty straightforwardly the case that 1A is well formed in English and 1B is not. And this is something that's going to be generally true of all nouns that have regular plurals. They're all going to do this number agreement kind of thing. Similarly, in 2A versus 2B here, grammatical versus ungrammatical, the little boy is speaking to a policeman versus the little boy is speak to a policeman. And here, this auxiliary verb, the copula, is in English. Actually, sorry, in this case, I think you wouldn't call that a copula. This is my syntactic ignorance showing up. But this auxiliary verb requires some kind of a participle that agrees with it, with regard to the progressive aspect or tense here. So you need is speaking. You need that speaking gerund form. Rather than the uninflected speak version here. And this is, again, a general property of English morphology, syntax, whatever, however you want to think of that. It's going to be something that applies to essentially all verbs, right? 4 and 5 here are showing us something slightly different. This is testing people's knowledge of lexically irregular nouns and verbs in English, right? So what does that mean? Well, here's 4A. A shoe salesman sees many feet throughout the day, where feet is an irregular plural. Right? Knowing the rules of English grammar, you're not able to predict the form of this plural from the form of the singular foot. In fact, if you used a regular rule of English grammar or of English morphology, you would get the output in 4B, which is ungrammatical. A shoe salesman sees many foots throughout the day. So what this is basically testing is whether people know that this noun, foot, in English has a irregular plural that's just listed in the lexicon as a separate word, basically. Right? So you have to just memorize the fact that foot happens to have an irregular plural. Same thing for the past tense here of the verb fly. Right? So a bat flies into our attic tonight. A bat flew into our attic last night. And again, that's a completely irregular form. There's no principle of English grammar that's going to tell you that this past tense of the verb fly needs to have a different vowel on it, or that it needs to be spelled in this particular bizarre way. And here's one with a sort of over, I don't know exactly what you'd call this. It's like a double irregular. So they've taken the past tense root flew and added the regular past tense duh into it, and you get a bat flewed into our attic last night. So again, just basically testing whether people know, whether they've memorized the irregular past tense form of this verb fly. Right? So this is 4 and 5 are really about lexical knowledge. Have you learned all of the lexical idiosyncrasies of English? In 14 and 15 here, these are subcategorization differences. And what does that refer to? Well, this is, again, kind of a mix of like syntax and lexical idiosyncrasies, where some verbs in English subcategorize, or they call for, and in this case, an infinitive phrase embedded under them. So this verb allows in English takes a direct object, and then it takes some kind of an embedded clause, and it is a property of the verb allow that it happens to require an infinitive clause in English. That's an untensed clause that's marked with this infinitival marker too. So the man allows his son to watch TV, versus the man allows his son watch TV, which is an ill-formed infinitive clause, although there could be another verb in English that sort of idiosyncratically happens to allow this kind of a clause rather than the infinitival one up here. So let, in this particular sense in 15a and b, means almost the same thing as allow, but it idiosyncratically subcategorizes for a different kind of embedded clause. So the grammatical option here would be the man lets his son watch TV. That's exactly like the ungrammatical option for allow. And the ungrammatical option for let is the man lets his son to watch TV, which is just like the grammatical option for allow. So this is certainly a syntactic property. It's about different kinds of embedded clauses and their sizes. So sometimes um, these clauses are called, I think, control clauses, and these are infinitival clauses. And the observation here is just that different English verbs that mean more or less the same thing, some of them happen to call for this infinitival marker, and some of them happen not to. Right? So this is, again, both a lexical and a grammatical feature of English. And then finally, we get to 23 and 24 here, and these are going to deal with question formation. So 23a here is a questioning of an adjunct temporal argument or a modifier. When will Sam fix his car? And this involves what's sometimes called inversion of the subject and the auxiliary here. So in the corresponding declarative, we would say, Sam will fix his car. But when you create this WH question, through some means, the auxiliary ends up before preceding the subject. So when will Sam fix his car? 23b here is ungrammatical in mainstream American English, when Sam will fix his car, although I believe there's some sort of non-standard or depreciated varieties of English where this would probably be fine. In any case, this is the judgments that go with the test here. 24a and b is something similar, but in this one, it is totally clear that 24b, actually, which is supposed to be the ungrammatical one, is completely fine in several regional and socio-lex of American English. These are generally going to be stigmatized varieties where this 24b form is okay. But in any case, in standard American English, 24a is grammatical. What do they sell at the corner store? And here we have this do support phenomenon where the corresponding declarative here would be they sell what at the corner store. When you form the WH question, it requires some sort of a supporting auxiliary. Do is the default option, or does in English, and so we call that do support. And 24b here without do support is considered ungrammatical in general American English, what they sell at the corner store, although that would be absolutely fine in, say, Appalachian English or in African American English. In several stigmatized varieties, this is a perfectly well-formed question. That said, we would expect probably these the subjects in this experiment being immigrants who are in a university community and are highly educated. It's not likely that they learned English, in a context with lots of stigmatized varieties going on. It's unlikely that they've learned regional American English or anything like that. They've probably learned standard American English. That said, it's worth paying attention to these items. So basically, we're going to see whether these 46 immigrants are able to reproduce these native speaker judgments of the kind indicated here. And what happens? Here's the sort of one headline result, is that in general, there is a giant negative correlation between age of arrival and how well you do on this grammaticality judgment task. So here we've used a control group of native speakers of English who are not immigrants from Korea or China, and they score right up near the top of the possible scores here. Their judgments look more or less just like Johnson and Newport's judgments. And if you progress over here to Korean and Chinese immigrants who arrived between the ages of 3 and 7 years old, their score is basically indistinguishable from those native speakers. After this point, anybody who arrived at a later age, going all the way up to the adult age at the end here, they get worse and worse and worse with the later they arrived. This shows itself as a negative slope, sloping down from left to right on the graph here, where this is the score on the grammaticality judgment, this is the age of arrival. And one of the ways that we measure relationships like this statistically is by using correlation. And basically, correlation measures to what extent two variables are related. So when variable 1 changes, in this case age of arrival, does variable 2 also tend to change in a predictable way? And so here, as age of arrival gets greater, you move from basically 0 to 3 to 7 to 8 to 10 to 11 to 15, the mean score on this variable gets lower, right? So this goes up, this goes down, and this manifests itself as a large negative relationship between the two variables. That's what this R statistic is telling us. It's a measurement of how closely related two variables are. 0 would be no relationship at all. 1 would be the strongest possible positive relationship, and -1 would be the strongest possible negative relationship. Sorry, did I just say negative twice? I meant that 1 would be the positive relationship and -1 would be the negative relationship. This relationship we find from these data is a very, very strong negative relationship between these two variables. So on a scale from -1 to 1, negative 0.77 is a gigantic correlation for human behavioral research. This is much bigger than the typical kind of effect you might find with data like this. So yes, there is a gigantic negative relationship between how old somebody arrived and their ultimate attainment on this particular grammaticality judgment task. So that's one headline result. Breaking the results out a bit more, I've taken two graphs that they give here which show subject by subject scores on this scatter plot. So this kind of a plot where you have variable 1 on axis 1 and variable 2 on axis 2 is referred to as a scatter plot, and it's one of the best and most efficient ways of summarizing data from a design like this. It allows us to really look at the individual subject scores and see what happened with everybody in the experiment, as well as seeing the overall relationship between these two variables. Now, they didn't give this in a single graph in the paper, so I've taken the two graphs they gave and sort of stretched the second one to try to make it look roughly like the scale in the first. And so you can sort of see the whole relationship here if you look across these two graphs. And here's maybe their single most important result that they make a lot out of. Within the group of people who arrived before age 15 or age 16, there is a giant negative relationship, right? So for real, actual human data, this is about as tight a relationship as you'll ever find between two variables. Within this group, the correlation here is negative 0.87. So that's even higher than the main effect that we found in the overall study from the previous graph. That is a massive negative relationship. It means that you can predict a lot about how somebody's going to be able to perform on this grammaticality judgment test just from knowing the age at which they arrived in the United States. So that is a hugely, hugely significant result in this group. Move over here. This is people who arrived after the age of 16. And all of a sudden, that relationship becomes much less clear. So this particular plot with the dots sort of scattered everywhere just sort of looks like a blob of dots. I mean, if you look at particular subgroupings here, you might be able to sort of see maybe there's some relationship with these ones and these other ones, but in general, this whole plot is basically a random blob of dots. And what that's showing us visually is that there's very little correlation between the two variables at all amongst this age group. So you arrive after age 17, doesn't really matter how old you are. You just sort of have wild variability in how people do on this task. They also measure the correlation here. It's slightly negative, so this is negative 0.16. That's a much smaller effect than the other ones we've seen so far. And by some test of how likely you would be to observe these results in a world where there was no relationship between these two variables, by some measurement of that, they're claiming that this difference is not significant. A lot of the papers, a lot of the studies that we're looking at in this class are going to be using p-values and telling you that things are statistically significant and non-significant. I would encourage you to not pay too much attention to that jargon. It's a really wildly flawed statistical paradigm. But look at the data itself, and that's often going to tell you what's going on. And here, it's pretty clear there's not much of a pattern between age of arrival and ultimate attainment on this grammaticality judgment task for this particular subject group. Now, that's basically like the main thing that comes out of looking at this graph, I'd say, at a first pass. Is basically that, yeah, there's like a really strong negative relationship here. You can see that because all these dots are arrayed on a downward diagonal from left to right, and there's not much here. The other thing that comes out from just looking at this is that in this group, there's some amount of variability in how people do. And then in this group, there's wild, wild variability in how people score on this test. It's just all over the place. So the general vertical range of this graph is almost twice as large as the general vertical range of this graph. This is a particular property that's referred to as heteroskedasticity. That's a giant statistical jargon term there. And all it means is that variability at one end of the scale is much, much smaller than variability at the other end of the scale. And this is important only because it's teaching us something interesting about the relationship between age of arrival and test scores here, which is that there's a lot more variability amongst adult arrivals than pre-16 arrivals. But the other thing that it's telling us is statistically, you're going to need to treat these variables in a sort of special way, and that these are not just behaving as like a normal variable that's normally distributed should behave. So you really can't use standard statistical modeling approaches on a variable like this. And that's going to become important later on when we see the debate back and forth about these kinds of results, that this particular variable with the grammaticality judgment task is wildly heteroskedastic. The other main thing to note here, and this has been a criticism that's been leveled at this paper, is that we have a general sparsity of subjects in between the ages of, say, 12 and 16 or so. Right? So there's these 5 folks here. There's like maybe one 17-year-old over here. But other than that, this is pretty sparsely populated at this crucial age, which they're saying is the cutoff between having a critical period and not being in the critical period, basically. There's not that many subjects in there. And another way of looking at this visually is if you just erase a couple of these dots, or if you erased all 3 of these particular dots here, all of a sudden the relationship here would be much, much smaller between the 2 variables. So when you look at this whole graph, this looks like a giant downward slope. But you remove just 2 or 3 subjects from this experiment, and all of a sudden the slope here looks much, much shallower. And so this is important as well. This shows that we can't be very confident in the reliability of a study like this because if all the results hinge on just 2 or 3 subjects being present versus absent, that suggests that if we ran the experiment again, there's no guarantee at all that it would come out the same way. So that's an important thing to pay attention to at all. These kinds of points in a scatter plot like this, or in a regression or correlation analysis, these are referred to as high leverage data points. And the idea being, if you took just a small number of data points and excluded them, the results of the study might look very, very different. So that's another thing to sort of pay attention to here and be cautious about. So there's certainly some weaknesses in here, but the headline result is that there's a giant effect of age of arrival on ultimate attainment for this particular task within the group of people who arrived before age 16, but within the group of people who arrived after age 16, this effect is much, much smaller or maybe entirely absent, right? So that's their headline results here. Okay, so what about the confounding variables that we were worried about? Well, here in Table 5, what they're showing us is that indeed there are really strong relationships between all of the confounders we worried about and either how people score on the test or when they arrived or both. Right? So this first result here, these are still correlation coefficients, so they range from -1 to 1, with 0 being absolutely no relationship. What are we seeing here? Well, these are attitudinal variables, so to what extent do you identify with the English language or with American culture? And here we're seeing that there's a strong positive correlation between how much people identify as American or identify with the English language and how well they score on the test. That is completely expected, unsurprising. And also, completely unsurprising, the earlier people arrived in the United States, the more identification they feel with American culture and with the English language. So that manifests itself as a strong negative correlation here. So these are completely expected results. For self-consciousness, this is the extent to which You might feel anxiety or embarrassment about speaking in a non-native language. The more of that you feel, the worse you do on the test. Again, not very surprising here. This effect is not quite as strong as some of the other ones, but it's still there. And there's some tendency for people who arrived later to be more self-conscious. They're again saying that according to some statistical tests, this doesn't come out significant. But I mean, it's still there. It's a small effect. It's not as robust as the other correlations here. The expected relationship is still basically there, though. It looks like self-consciousness, not as strong a predictor, not as strong a confounder as the other attitudinal variables. And this last one is motivation. So how important is it for you to speak English in your daily life or in your work life or in your family life, things like that. And again, completely expected pattern here, right? So people who are more motivated to speak English in their daily lives score higher on the test, and they tend to be the people who arrived in the country earlier. So what this table is basically telling us is that, yes, we were right to be worried about confounders because all of these variables, identification and motivation are pretty strongly confounded with age of arrival, and they have large effects on test scores. Therefore, the effects that we're looking at here and that we've labeled age of arrival, we need to be worried that this is not really about age of arrival at all, that instead it's about one of these confounding variables. Self-consciousness, less so, but still worth looking at. So what are we going to do? Excuse me. This is the kind of adjusting for confounders analysis that I mentioned earlier. And it's a type of thing that, again, should be taken with a grain of salt. But here's what they're going to do. They're going to look at the correlation between these variables and age of arrival. And they're going to model that relationship so that each value of age of arrival is assigned a predicted score on identification, self-consciousness, or motivation. Then they're going to subtract those effects of age of arrival out, and this is called residualizing these variables. And they're going to use this to try to get a measure of identification, self-consciousness, and motivation that's completely independent of age of arrival, right? So if we can model the relationship between those two variables and then subtract out the age of arrival part, we'll come to a measure of components of these variables that are independent of age of arrival. Once we do that, we can look at the effect of identification, self-consciousness, and motivation on the grammatical test score independent of age of arrival. Right? So what do we see here? Well, identification still has a pretty strong effect or correlation on test scores, even when you remove age of arrival from the equation. Similarly for self-consciousness, this is kind of, I was confusing myself thinking that this had reversed. It's not. So independent of age of arrival, identifying with American culture makes you more likely to score highly on the test. Independently of age of arrival, feeling self-consciousness about English makes you likely to score lower on the test. Interestingly, when you take age of arrival out of the motivation variable, it looks like motivation by itself, independent of age of arrival, has very little effect on the test score whatsoever. So it looks like the effect of motivation on test scores that we saw up here is entirely a function of the fact that more motivated people tend to be those who arrived at an earlier age. When you put age of arrival into the analysis or subtract it out from this variable, the effect basically vanishes. That's kind of interesting. Now we're going to do the same thing in the other direction. So we're going to see, once we residualize these for age of arrival, we still get some pretty strong effects on test scores. What about when we look at age of arrival and subtract out the confounds with these attitude variables, right? So this is going to be the exact same thing, but in the opposite direction. We're going to measure the relationship between age of arrival and identification. We're going to assign a predicted effect of identification, of age of arrival and identification at every value of age of arrival, and then we're going to subtract that out to try to get at the effect of age of arrival when you control for or adjust for identification. So this is, what does age of arrival do independently of the identification variable, how much you identify with American culture? Well, the effect here is still incredibly strong, and in particular, it's much stronger than the effect of identification independent of AOA. So what we're really comparing here is how strong is the independent effect of identification on test scores and the independent effect of AOA on test scores. And the answer is that AOA is much stronger. Same thing if you try to residualize age of arrival and get a measure of it that's independent from self-consciousness, gigantic effect of AOA, smaller, much smaller effect of self-consciousness when you remove age of arrival. And for this last one, there was little effect at all of motivation independent of age of arrival, but again, gigantic effect of AOA independent of motivation. So what this is telling us, at least Johnson and Newport claim, is that AOA is a much more robust and important predictor of how people perform on this grammaticality judgment task than any of the attitude variables are. This is the claim anyway. So that's what Johnson and Newport have to say here. And so the claim is that indeed there is a critical period. And in these data, it appears to be around 15 years old, which is much later than the theory sort of would have predicted. But they're claiming at least that you can see an effect of AOA in this data that is qualitatively different in adulthood than it is in childhood. And that supports the idea that there's a critical period, not only for first language acquisition, which we know from previous literature, but also for learning a foreign language. So people who arrive in early childhood end up performing much like native speakers on this grammaticality judgment task, but people who arrive later get worse and worse until the adult arrivals. There's basically no relationship between age of arrival and test scores at all. They're just sort of all over the place and wildly variable. This study becomes kind of a lightning rod for criticism from people who don't believe in the critical period for second language acquisition. And there's a lot of similar studies done. We'll look at one of them in the next set of slides. But this is a follow-up study by Dekeyser from 2000, which is both trying to replicate that original finding from Johnson and Newport and asking some really interesting follow-up questions, right? So they're going to do the same thing where they look at the effect of age of arrival on a battery of well-formedness judgments. And in fact, I think they use the exact same test or a subset of the test from the original Johnson and Newport study. But then they're going to add another component here, which is using a general verbal aptitude test, right? And the question here will be, to what extent does ultimate attainment correlate with general verbal aptitude? And crucially, does that relationship differ for younger and older speakers? Now, verbal aptitude here is meant to be a construct that I guess is specifically about foreign language classroom learning, as far as I understand it. And so the idea here is that this is going to correlate with some kind of explicit knowledge or ability to do intellectual tasks rather than sort of basic linguistic cognition. And yeah, so we'll get to that in a second. The idea being that learning during the critical period would make use of modular mechanisms that are innate, biologically specified. They don't differ much between people. So universal grammar is not thought to be particularly different, even for smart and dumb people. Doesn't make much of a difference. We're all able to, grasp basic facts about syntax, at least implicitly, regardless of our general intelligence or our verbal aptitude or our ability to do classroom foreign language learning tasks. And so there shouldn't be much difference between people with different levels of intelligence or verbal aptitude or whatever this verbal aptitude test is measuring. Shouldn't make much of a difference if the critical period folks here are making use of domain-specific biological linguistic mechanisms like universal grammar. Learning after the critical period, at least under Dekeyser's proposal here, doesn't make use of those innate modular mechanisms. It's some other explicit ability to learn languages that's important here. More specifically, it could be something like how smart you are, or your general verbal aptitude, or your classroom aptitude for being able to do classroom exercises that would predict how well you do at learning a foreign language at this age. Those kinds of abilities vary widely between individuals. Unlike basic, syntactic learning of a first language, there's a huge amount of variability between different people in how smart or how good they are at verbal classroom tasks. And so for these older arrivals, the idea is that verbal aptitude, this construct, should have a strong correlation with their ultimate attainment in the second language, as opposed to this earlier arrival group where it shouldn't make much difference at all because they're basically using their UG. So what does Dekeyser do here? He's also trying to address a number of criticisms of that original Johnson and Newport study that have popped up in the intervening years. And so one of the criticisms there was that Johnson and Newport blended Chinese and Korean speakers. These are two extremely different languages. And you can imagine maybe there's some heterogeneity there that they didn't account for. They're also, I was going to say there are also languages that are extremely distant from English, although that's also true of the language that Dekeyser uses here, so that's not fixing that issue. But here, Dekeyser uses a monolithic group of Hungarian speakers. There were criticisms of the Johnson and Newport paper because some of the immigrants in that paper hadn't been in the U.S. for that long. I think there were some who'd only been there for 7 to 10 years. And the claim is that, well, maybe those ones just haven't reached their ultimate attainment yet. If you give them more time, maybe they'll get better at this task. And so here, Dekeyser used a sample of much older speakers who had been in the United States much longer. So the average length of residence in the United States for the subjects here was an average of 34 years. Right? So these people have been in the U.S. for a long, long time. They used a shorter test. I think it was a subset of the Johnson and Newport materials. This was another criticism of that original study. There were like 275 items on the Johnson and Newport test, which it must have taken like an hour or more, a couple hours to do that test. And maybe people just lost focus, although that wouldn't explain the results. It's the kind of thing that people criticize in experiments like that. That said, having a too long test shouldn't make a difference for people who arrived earlier versus arrived later. Unless you already grant the critical period hypothesis. Nonetheless, people like to nitpick about experimental design, so there was a lot of criticism that the Johnson and Newport test was too long. Dekeyser used a much shorter test, and he was testing older people. At their age at testing was 55 years old. He also adds in a verbal aptitude test, which I think is some kind of a classroom assessment of language learning abilities. Now, this instrument is not described in any detail at all in the paper, which is bad Dekeyser. You need to explain what kinds of materials you're using in any experiment to the level that people could replicate your experiment just by reading the paper. Dekeyser does not do that here. He doesn't tell us much about this verbal aptitude test. Presumably, it's testing some sort of explicit reasoning and problem-solving abilities. Maybe it's something like the SAT verbal component, but for a foreign language. I'm not exactly sure. The main technical point for the paper is that scores on this test are going to vary widely between subjects, and so we can use it to try to predict people's native likeness in their grammaticality judgments. What does Dekeyser find? Well, so first he replicates Johnson and Newport to some extent with a gigantic negative relationship between age of arrival on the one hand, and their scores on this grammaticality judgment test on the other hand. So again, this is a scatter plot, just like the one, excuse me, in the Johnson and Newport paper. Here he's drawn some additional lines here. This vertical line is showing you age 16. This is the crucial cutoff point that Johnson and Newport found in their paper. And indeed, you can see that subjects on the left here who arrived at an age earlier than 16 do much, much better than subjects on the right, and that there's a huge amount of variability for subjects who arrived as adults versus very limited variability in the native likeness of these grammaticality judgments for people who arrived before age 16, right? So that's replicating Johnson and Newport. This vertical line here, I believe, is meant to be a cutoff for the lowest possible score that could qualify as being roughly native-like. And the observation is that almost all of the pre-age 16 arrivals are above that cutoff point, and almost all of the post-age 16 arrivals are below it. So again, this is supporting a kind of strong relationship between how people do on this test and when they arrived in the country or started learning the language. Interestingly, the one thing that comes out slightly different here from the Johnson and Newport study, is that here there is, again, a gigantic overall negative correlation between these two variables that has a correlation, I think it's about negative 0.6, so very, very strong relationship. But when you separate out these arrivals from these arrivals, so the earlier arrivals from the later arrivals, within each one of these groups, there's very limited correlations between age of arrival and the performance on this test. So that strong negative relationship between how late you arrived and how native-like your judgments are appears to be almost entirely a function of the difference between the early arrivals and the late arrivals. It's not really the case that within either group, people who arrived later are doing worse on this test, or at least there's not a strong effect in that direction. So that's, again, also an interesting finding. And they replicate the massive increase in variation with adult arrivals versus childhood ones. Now, here's the novel thing here. We're going to split the group into adult arrivals and child arrivals, and then see whether verbal aptitude can be used to predict people's native likeness of their judgment scores, right? So here's what he's finding. The correlation between the grammaticality judgment test score and the aptitude score was limited, though positive, for the group as a whole. He's calling this non-significant. Again, this has to do with significance testing. Let's just say that if this effect is even real, that it's a pretty small one, right? We shouldn't make too much of it. There hardly is any relationship at all between people's verbal aptitude score for foreign language classroom learning and how well they do on this grammaticality judgment task. That said, if you look only at the people who arrived after age 16, the correlation is actually medium, right? That's not a giant correlation, 0.33, but it's certainly a lot bigger than it is for the group as a whole. And the estimate from his particular statistical model is that a relationship like that is unlikely to have arisen by chance if there were really no underlying relationship between the two variables. You'd be very unlikely to observe a correlation this large in such a large group. And so the claim here is that there is a modest relationship here for adults, that the better you are on this classroom foreign language learning test, the better or more native-like your grammaticality judgments are. That said, for participants who arrived before the age of 16, that correlation is much, much smaller. It's almost nothing, right? And so there is basically within the group of people who arrived in the country before age 16, you don't get much of a relationship at all between their general verbal foreign language classroom ability and how native-like their English is, at least on this grammaticality judgment test. That is really interesting. And what it's suggesting, or what Dekeyser thinks it's suggesting at least, is that the kinds of abilities that you're bringing to bear on learning a foreign language are completely qualitatively different if you start learning the language in childhood than if you start learning the language as an adult. If you're learning the language during childhood, whatever is making you more or less native-like in your learning is not this sort of general explicit reasoning and problem solving that the verbal aptitude test is testing. That's not what's driving your performance. But if you arrive as an adult, then that is exactly what's driving your performance. Not all of it, but a significant component of your native likeness of how you acquire a second language that you start learning as an adult just relates to your explicit reasoning and problem solving skills, the kinds of things that this aptitude scores measure. So this is really adding a new kind of argument that, in fact, foreign language learning as an adult is qualitatively different than foreign language learning as a child. Now, all of these results have been challenged, and there's a whole lot of other results out there in this literature. We're going to turn to some of those results in our next lecture and see what kinds of arguments are going on back and forth between these two opposing camps. Thanks.